do remember my first visit to a mental hospital. I was a student minister at the time in South Melbourne, and I went to see Tom, who suffered of we now know as a bipolar type of illness. And it was at Larundel. And Larundel these days is used for Year 9 students at Ivanhoe Grammar. Same usage, as far as I'm concerned. And anyhow, I remember going to the closed ward and hearing the door click behind me. And I thought, I'm here forever. And I looked around, and there were people who looked very, very normal. There were people who wanted to talk to me. There were people that asleep in their lounge chairs, drugged out of their minds. And I confess that I felt most uncomfortable in that situation. I talked to Tom for a while, and I was glad to get out of it, because we all feel uncomfortable when we're confronted with forms of mental illness. And there's a good chance that 1 in 4 Australians suffer from some form of mental illness, and it could be that in our room today there could have been people who have been through this. And sometimes it's very mild. It might be a form of sadness, and you can't identify why we're feeling sad. Whatever it is, when we get out of touch with reality, we are suffering, if you like, some form of illness. And if it hasn't happened to you, it's happened to someone in your family or a relative. Now, haven't we made great strides as far as that's concerned? You go back 100 years and you're locked away and they drug you out of your mind, and if you ever got out there, you were lucky. But these days, we're much more aware. Mark and I were talking to a psychiatrist when we were on holidays. We didn't need the consultation, we just chatted to him. And he was saying that the psychiatry and the study of the brain is the last hurdle that medicine is facing. And I think that is true, but we have come so far. So, let's see the situation of the disciples. Here they are, if you look at the context of what was read to us. Here they are, first of all, out of the lake. And there's a great storm, and they feel overwhelmed by it. And in the stern of the boat is Jesus asleep and feeling very much in control. And the disciples say, Lord, don't you care that we're going to perish? And Matthew has it a little bit differently. Matthew says, Lord, save us, we're about to perish. And so it's a crisis. And here they are, they've got over the crisis, Jesus calms the storm, and they head for the shore. And heading for the shore, what do they hear? They hear the sorting of pigs, so they feel uncomfortable, Jewish people, pigs. And they hear of a wild man and yelling out at the top of his voice. They're going towards the tombs, and it seems like they're going from one disaster to another. Isn't that sometimes the story of our lives? One disaster to another. And when you look at Mark's Gospel, when you look at the whole context, there's the healing, and Jesus gets into trouble for that, for healing on the Sabbath. There are the temptations with the devil, which would be a rather horrible experience. He's accused of mixing with the wrong people. Now he's got another source of terror. And you would say that if you're going to follow Jesus, if you can't go around behind him, it's not going to be a boring experience. It seems like there was one disaster to another. And the other thing we notice when we're looking at this series of Jesus met, people that Jesus met, the other thing we notice is that he meets them in funny places. Jericho, Zacchaeus, up a tree. A couple of weeks' time, we look at the woman at the well, and Samaria, well, midday. It's a strange place to be meeting people. Now, here is Jesus heading towards Gentile country. Here in the country of peace, and the tomb, and the madman. Are there places that you feel uncomfortable? I feel uncomfortable in a noisy pub. If I go in there for a meal or something like that, I feel uncomfortable. I have to say that there are some times in churches where I feel uncomfortable. I feel uncomfortable in those churches where the guys wear funny hats and wave the smoke around and things like that. And I also feel uncomfortable at the other end of the spectrum, where people are yelling and screaming and falling on the floor and all that type of thing. I can feel uncomfortable in the changing room of football teams, which I told you about last week. And sometimes we need to be in uncomfortable places. And the church sometimes needs to be in uncomfortable places. 1970s, after the Family Law Act was changed by Lionel Murphy, and we encountered a whole lot of people being separated and divorced. And we as a church decided at this stage we would minister to those people. And our board felt most uncomfortable about the fact that we were bringing separated and divorced people into the church. And one guy had the insight to say, oh, surely it's their fault. Regardless of whose fault it is, we needed to minister to them. Or what about the priest who took on a particular role during the AIDS epidemic of ministering to people who had AIDS? Or what about churches that minister in pubs? We sometimes need to be in uncomfortable places. And here is Jesus in the tombs. So, he encounters a guy who is possessed by demons, and we would say today that he is suffering a mental illness. And we ask ourselves the question, why did he suffer? Why is there mental illness around today? And I'd be crazy to try and answer the question, but let me make a few suggestions. Some people inherit the tendency to be like that. Sometimes chemical addictions. And while we want to legalise marijuana, let me tell you that people who have a strong addiction to marijuana often end up in the schizophrenic type of mode. Sometimes stress. Sometimes faulty parenting. Sometimes chemical issues. Sometimes brain tumours. But what about possessions? Demon possession. Do you believe it? No, well, I sort of do. I want to say another comment about this later in the stage. But churches that focus on demon possession and want to cast out evil spirits of all types sometimes do more harm than good. And we need to be quite wary of it. But, having said that, evil does play a factor as far as mental illness is concerned. If people are continually stressed because of the pressure of work, if people are addicted to some type of drug or booze or have a poor upbringing, you can see that mental illness follows that. And when you look around the world, and here I'm going to make a sweeping comment, if we are able to lessen the impact of mental illness, there'd be less murders, particularly in the United States and in Australia. There'd be less world issues, and overcome mental illness, and you overcome many of the problems of the world. Now, here we've got a contrast. In the scene, we presume that the disciples eventually get out of the way. In the scene, we have disciples, probably feeling quite agitated, quite nervous about the fact that they're in the presence of the tombs, the pigs, and the wild man. Here you've got this guy, naked, chains broken, yelling at the top of his voice, quite obviously out of his mind. And as a contrast to all of that, you've got the Jesus of dignity. You go back to the storm. Master, don't you care that we are perishing? And he stands up, the man of dignity and calm. When he is accused of all types of things in the early part of Mark's Gospel, the man of dignity. And here we see it again, the man of dignity. Well, we encountered last week Zacchaeus, a lonely man. Counted in a few weeks' time with the woman at the well, a lonely woman. And here is a man who is isolated and is also lonely. And what does Jesus see? Does he do what I was doing with a minute before, trying to work out why there is mental illness and why people suffer? No. He sees tragedy. He sees a tormented person. He sees a person who is isolated. And in each of these cases, and many of these stories we're going to look at in the next few weeks, we're going to see people who are not living fruitful lives. And this guy is producing a lot of energy, running around, yelling at the top of his voice, breaking chains, but not achieving anything. And like Zacchaeus, he was a man who didn't have community. Perhaps like Zacchaeus, he had no purpose. And the interesting thing about this guy is he has religion. Think about it. And the devils or the demons start saying to, get out of our way, the Holy Son of God, and so on, the Son of the Most High God. And it's interesting that when you go through Mark's Gospel, the only people who identify that Jesus is the Son of God are the demons. And for one stage, Peter gets close to it, and also some Gentiles as well. Now, it's interesting. Marge has regular correspondence with a person who is a distant relative of hers, who we feel is schizophrenic. And his schizophrenia comes out in the way that he writes, the emails that he sends. And he is a very religious person. And often when we're thinking of mental illness, sometimes religion starts to get confused with it as well. Many years ago, I was attending a psychiatrist session with other ministers, and he played for us a recording of one of his patients. We didn't know it at the time. And the recording showed that the guy said, Jesus let me here, Jesus let me there, this is the will of Jesus. And we said, well, we hear people like that talking in the church quite often. Sometimes we talk like that ourselves. And he said, no, this guy is full-blown schizophrenic, and he's hearing voices, and they are religious voices. You know your history, you know the story of Joan of Arc, and she was a leader of the French Revolution, and she heard voices. And people say today that perhaps she was bipolar. And I guess we learn from that not every religious voice that we hear is authentic. And John tells us, 1 John tells us, to test the spirits to see if they are of God. Not every religious voice is authentic. And certainly when it comes out as far as the people with mental illness are concerned. So he is possessed by demons. Where is this? It is. Okay. It's been there for a couple of weeks. So he's possessed by demons. And I was asking before whether they exist today. Well, there seems to be something demonic about our world and something about the way our world behaves. And sometimes we're possessed with the idea of success, achievement, popularity, business. And sometimes we find that these demons can force us into places where we are in the tombs, the places of death. Sometimes we think that by obeying these demons, these voices that we hear, that it will create community. But often it just creates isolation.